Hi everyone, Bromane Jenkins here. Today on Let's Learn, I'm going to discuss something I'm a little more well versed in than other Let's Learns, and that is jet engines. I've been working on jet engines for the last 3 years now, and I've had a lot of fun doing it and a lot of frustration, especially when you're working on a new engine with a lot of new people who don't really want to follow the Charter Parts Council and such, and you get a bunch of deviations and you have to go clean up their mess. But that's well behind me now, sort of. Anyways, I wanted to talk a bit about this because I just trained a new batch of people to come in and do a job similar to mine, and they have no concept of how a jet engine works. Now that I'm industrial, that's totally fine. If you understand the principles of how to make the parts that we're trying to track and get to the engines and do all the testing on, you're good. But if you don't understand how a jet engine works directly, it's a bit of a problem. And I took them to our company's customer training center, and I got a lot more questions about how the thing actually works. Then I got questions on the parts, how they're manufactured, what planes they were on, anything like that. And I got a lot of questions on why the fan was so big. So I'll get into all that stuff. It's just something that came up, and then I decided I wanted to do this. So I'll try to get into that in a bit. So when I say jet engines, I'm actually talking about turbofans. Turbofans are a type of engine where the turbine is mated up with the fan blade, turning in some way. And high bypass turbofans specifically are what I have the most expertise in. Actually, it's the only thing I have expertise in outside of a couple meetings I sat in on the 135. But high bypass turbofans are pretty much exclusive to, for the most part, exclusive to commercial engines. If you've been on a jet, you've probably been on a jet with a high bypass turbofan. High bypass turbofans have a lot more air dedicated to flowing around the engine than going into the engine. So very little of the air that gets pulled in by the fan actually goes in and is used to propel the engine forward. This is because high bypass turbofans use the fan, the incredible length of it, or size of it, and something called a tractor configuration on the engine to pull in a bunch of air, and that moves the plane forward much more than the thrust it produces. And this is why you have those giant fans, and it was a little difficult to explain that, believe it or not. So on military engines, they're considered low bypass turbofans, and much of their technology is pretty much right up front. The fan doesn't bring in a lot of air that isn't used for enriching the air-fuel mixture and making this thing go as fast as possible. And you can actually see that in the fact that they use afterburner. The military engines use thrust more than they use pulling by the fan. And here's a shot of the SR-71 in afterburner, or the SR-71 engine in afterburner. As you can see, it gets really hot in there. This will be explained in a little bit. So in a high bypass turbofan, after the air comes in through the fan, it goes into the rest of the fan case, and it first hits these things called fan exit guide vanes. Vanes and guide vanes in particular make sure that the air travels on a certain path, follows a very specific arrow path, and prevents something called impulse, which is basically, in the easiest terms possible, like a surge of air that kind of goes rogue inside the compressor. And I've seen the pictures of what happens when that goes down, and it can wreck up a series of compressor blades. They're like titanium with completely insane coatings. It's ugly, and by putting these vanes in there, they add weight to the engine and they add complexity, but it also makes the engine much safer to run. So once all the vanes have been cleared, and there's further vanes, there's a set of vanes called stator vanes that are activated by hydraulic systems within the that are attached to the engine, I should say. And once everything gets past all these vanes, the air that actually goes into the engine itself is going to go into what's called a compressor case. Compressor cases they're similar to the turbine cases we're going to discuss later on, and they're basically a series of discs with blades attached. The blades are actually shaped like the Nike swoosh logo, if you want to think of it, if you're looking straight down at one. And this forms the air, it compresses it, and it pushes it on forward because the engine's moving forward. The more air is coming in at all times, and it pushes it from the low compressor into the high compressor, and the high compressor compresses it even more, and it pushes it into the diffuser case. Now, the diffuser case is where the fuel mixture is applied to the air and then ignited. It's actually ignited with these big too big, I should say, basically spark plugs that come in from the engine, called igniters, because they're simple like that. And the igniters basically set the air on fire through electrical current and push it out further. It goes through. I should make note of this. But as we're going into the engine, it's basically ramping up to a very small point before the air goes into the diffuser case. And when it comes out of the diffuser case, it gets only a little bit larger going into the turbines. And this is by design, because the more you actually force this air into smaller and smaller spaces, because from science class we know that gases will try to form into whatever space they're put into. So as you force it into smaller and smaller spaces, the pressure builds up, and when it finds an escape, in this case going out the other end of the engine, it'll go faster, so that produces more thrust. So it then hits the high pressure turbines, and what's worth noting here is that on two spool engines, or twin spool engines, the high turbine and the high compressor are actually attached to each other. And then the low turbine and the low compressor are attached to each other by a shaft within a shaft. And this is beneficial because the high compressor and the low compressor and the high turbine and the low turbine want to spin at different speeds. The high compressor and the high turbine want to spin at about the same speed, and the low compressor and the low turbine want to spin at about the same speed. So this really helps everything at once. This means that you're going to see a much more fuel-efficient engine because you're actually keeping everything basically where it wants to be, except for the fan. The fan wants to spin at a slower speed than anything it's attached to. And this is conquered in a couple ways. Most engines ignore it completely. A few engines use what are called geared turbofans, including the engines I'm working on, which means that there's a reduction gear system, or actually it's an elliptical gear, coming in that attaches to the shaft and spins the fan at a different speed. And that actually creates a huge fuel efficiency gain, because you're not having to push all this air through the turbine to turn the compressor to turn the fan. So anyways, getting back to the topic at hand, one of those things that comes out of this is the thrust. The thrust of the engine goes past all the turbines, goes through another set of vanes at the very end of the engine, and pushes the engine forward as well as the fan pulls it forward. So on all this, I want to mention that a lot of people think that titanium is the be-all end-all metal in a jet engine. This is untrue, because titanium has a yield temperature of about 500 degrees. I think it's actually like 530, something like that. Inside the turbine blades are usually a nickel superalloy with some titanium in there. It's covered in these strange coatings. I've held these things in my hand. I've cleaned out the insides of them. Turbine blades are very small to very large. Same with compressor blades. None of them are all the same size. And then this entire turbine section is basically slathered with ceramic material. The engine temperature, even on a turbofan, a high bypass turbofan, which relies more on air coming in than the air going out, it gets very, very hot. And you're not going to be able to put naked metal in there. So you have to put on all sorts of coatings, you have to put on all sorts of materials to make this work. The other thing is, turbines are very interesting because the section of the engine the turbines are in, because it's after where all the fuel is being ignited, it requires a cooling system on the external cases to actually keep the blades from getting too far away from the case itself. This is a situation known as tip loss, where air is going around the blades in multiple directions, and this makes the blades less efficient. What you want to do is minimize the amount of air that goes over the blades or under the blades in any way you can. This is why GE's LeapX engine, which uses what are called blisks, where the blades are associated directly with the disc, instead of being put into a configuration with a disc that attaches to a shaft. This is why something like that works, but on most engines they actually try to cool the outer cases and keep the case as close to the turbine blade as possible, if not almost contacting it. This increases efficiency, and the better your cooling system is, theoretically the better your turbine is going to function. Another thing to point out is that the shaft does not just hang there, suspended in any, without any help. There are at least 5 bearing compartments in most engines, and this is exactly what you think it is. It's ball bearings that roll against the shaft in designated spots, and there are also roller bearings, which look much different. They roll in place, similar to a rolling pin or something like that you'd see on a conveyor line. So, with this in mind, I wanted to talk for a brief second about military engines, and that's where a lot of crazy stuff happens, because they have to produce a lot of thrust and also meet a lot of different requirements. So let's talk about the F-135 engine when it's in the Stovall mode, or the carrier mode, if you want to call it that. Actually, I think this is the Marine configuration I'm showing now. But it basically has to be able to hover, so you get a crazy situation like this. You get roll bars, you get a forward case, fan case, you get this crazy shaft that actually absorbs a lot of horsepower, so you can't get as much energy out of it as you normally would. And you get stuff like the SR-71 engine that turns bright orange when you turn afterburner on, because it's getting so much heat to go fast. So I hope everyone learned a little bit today about jet engines. I know it was a little scattershot, but I didn't have as much time as I'd like. Thanks.